I'm joined today by Ben Eubanks, Chief Research Officer at Lighthouse Research and Advisory, and two of my colleagues from Advanced RPO, Paul Wolf, Director of Client Delivery, and Mike Foster, who's an Account Director. Just a reminder for everyone on the webinar, if you have a question, please enter it into the Q&A section of Zoom, and we'll be sure to answer it at the end of the session. We're excited for a lively discussion today around the headlines and data telling us what's happening in the marketplace when it comes to jobs, candidates, and the entire hiring process. Before we jump into the discussion, I'm going to have our panelists do some quick introductions. As I mentioned, I'm Kevin Armstrong, Program Director with Advanced RPO. I have responsibility for non-exempt high-volume hiring across a pretty large client base of different industries. I've been with Advanced RPO for over 10 years and I have about 17 years, which I think I'm going to stop counting here soon, of RPO experience. I have enough RPO experience to be dangerous. We'll just leave it at that. Mike Foster, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, Kevin. And 10 years at Advance is impressive. I think longest tenured employee, correct?
Longest tenured employee, yes, that's me.
So Mike Foster, I'm based out of Charleston, South Carolina. I've been with Advance now for 4 years as an account manager and then promoted into an account director while I was here. And my role is managing our client base that would focus more on the exempt level type positions. A lot of times, in the clinical IT, all different kind of industries, it would vary across my client base. And then I would also manage the teams that would support that client base as well. Been in recruitment now for 15 years, 8 of which have been managing recruitment teams and designing recruitment programs. And 11 of those 15 years have been within RPO. So not as much as Kevin, but getting pretty close. So maybe one of these days I'll catch up, Kev.
Great, thanks, Mike. Hey, Paul, you want to do a quick intro?
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone. Thanks for jumping on. I'm Paul Wolf, Director of Client Delivery here at Advanced RPO. I've been with Advanced for 5 years, actually. 5-year anniversary coming up next week. 23 years of experience in recruitment and talent acquisition, the last 13 of which has been RPO. I work out of my home office in northeastern Pennsylvania, and my role in the organization very similar to Mike. I oversee a book of clients really around the exempt hiring and the strategic oversight of those customers and the management of my teams that support them. So looking forward to the conversation today. With that said, I'd like to turn it over to Ben, and so he can give us the introduction.
All right, wonderful. Thank you, Paul. Hey, everybody. So glad to be here with you. I am Ben Eubanks. I spend my days as the Chief Research Officer for Lighthouse Research and Advisory. So I get to do 2 different kinds of research. One on the technologies and tools that we're using to attract and convert and hire people. And the other side of that, as we'll go through today, a lot of qualitative and quantitative research on what is happening in the workplace, what's happening when it comes to hiring trends, what candidates want, how we're trying to solve some of the problems from the hiring perspective, all those kinds of things. And so I'm really excited to be here with this incredible group of guys to talk through some of the things we're seeing, some of the data from my end, and then from them, some of the boots on the ground perspective about what's changing, what's trending, all that kind of good stuff. All right. Anything else, Kevin, before we dive in?
Nope, that's it. Thanks, Ben. Go ahead and
take it away.
Go to the first one. Yeah.
All right, wonderful. All right, so we're going to go through this. We've got it kind of set up in a pretty simple way. We're going to share a couple stats with each of these big trends, and then I'm going to get some insights from, again, the incredible set of people here about what's going on, what they're seeing, all that kind of good stuff. So this is based off of a big study we did earlier this year, a big TA study. We had over 1,000 employers and 1,000 candidates in this, asking them about all kinds of priorities, challenges, how things are changing and evolving. We're actually gearing up for our 2023 study that's going to happen early next year. I can't wait to see what's happening, what's changing there as well. So lots of good stuff coming down the line. But one of the challenges that I know I hear from talent leaders every single day is we're trying to figure out, what are they doing? How do we stack up? How do we compare? Or is what we're seeing what everyone else is seeing? And so we're going to share some of these things with you in the session today so that you get a better understanding of some of the things that are happening out there broadly, and you can compare and contrast. And please do ask a question, throw a comment in if you'd like to. We'd love to hear from you as we go through this. We want to make sure this is as relevant and helpful to you as possible. That said, our big one, number one, I know you've probably heard of this, right? Ghosting. Candidates are ghosting employers. It is a big challenge. I don't think I've been to an event this year, in person or virtual, where I bring that up that I don't get some kind of visceral response, like, kind of pulling your hair out a little bit, because it's really tough for us as business leaders to plan, decide what's next when we don't know if someone's really going to do what they've said they're going to do when they show interest in a position. So in the research we did this year, the number one reason we found when it comes to someone that applies and they kind of disappear, we can't connect with them anymore, is that once they found out more about the job, didn't really interest them anymore, which to me is actually a good reason. We'd love that. We'd love for you to self-select out before we get too far down the path and find out, oh, they're not a good fit for us anyway. So that's probably not a bad thing. But number two and number three, if you look here, are actually very closely related to speed. So someone accepting another job before you can get yours to them, or the hiring process was just too long, too complicated, and they hit the eject button, they got out of there. So we're seeing that how quickly we can turn this around and how quickly we're able to respond to candidates is a big priority for them. And if I can tell you, honestly, I was hoping in this study, we'd have like one answer that was far above everything else, and I could just kind of say, hey, solve that. But as you see, the top three things here are actually within about 1% of each other. So they're really, really close together. And not only that, but one other thing I'll throw out there, and then I want to get some input from the crew here. But one thing we're seeing around changing expectations and what's socially acceptable is employees are telling us that when they accept a job, only 1 out of 3 of those are actually saying, I'm committed to that company. The other 2 out of 3 are saying anything from, I'm going to keep my options open for a few weeks. Even after I've started, they're going to keep those options open up until I'm always going to be open to other opportunities. Even if I've just started a job, I'm still going to keep entertaining other offers. And so it's a kind of a wild West scenario out there. I'd love to open it up to the team. I think, Paul, you want to take the lead on this one?
Sure. I appreciate it, Ben. Yeah, quite interesting, right? I think anybody in talent acquisition and recruiting, I know many of you on the call experience this. It's very frustrating. It's frustrating for us in talent acquisition, for our recruiters, and obviously for the hiring managers and the client. A lot of hard work goes into that, right? To have that happen. We all say it's unprofessional. Why do they do that? Well, it's not always because everyone's unprofessional. So some of the things you pointed out, Ben, my experience in what we see across our client base is speed, to your point, is a big factor in that. A lot of candidates are lingering in the process for a long time. So I call it my own acronym SEE, right? And it's speed, it's efficiency, and it's engagement. Those 3 things, applying those really help to avoid or lower that ghosting around that. So for example, you mentioned telling here, 33% to 67% would still consider the job after accepting the offer. So what you have there is when they accept the offer, organizations need to do a better job of engaging with those. They're not new hires yet, right? They haven't started, but they're newly offered candidates. From the time they accept those offers to the time they start, typically about 3 weeks right now, right? Could be a little bit longer. They need to be highly engaged. So there's a number of ways that organizations can do that. We could go on and on about that, but starting to put them in touch with team members, managers being in touch. We've had to educate a lot of hiring managers to continue to be in touch with that candidate well after they've made the offer. So some things around that we tend to see can help with the ghosting. One last thing before I turn it over to my colleagues is we're talking about, we have a lot of candidates into the market now are Gen Z, and they're different. They expect and they're wired for immediacy. That's a fact. The quicker we can engage with them and make decisions, the less ghosting will occur. And those individuals will be 5 years from now, the middle and senior level folks. Their mindset will never change around the immediacy part of it, right? That's Gen Z. So interesting things that we learn out there, real world experience. So help my counterparts.
Yeah, I can jump in. So one of the other things I think it's an excellent point about speed, Paul. But when people who in talent acquisition hear speed, they tend to think about just dropping rigor, right, and dropping portions of the process that actually allow us to determine whether or not this candidate's any good or not. That's the extreme example of speed. I don't think we're in that market anymore. I think more companies were using that over the last 18 months. But that specifically speaks to this first bullet point here about, we didn't give that candidate enough information in that process, even though we did it in 2 weeks, pat ourselves on the back. That's great. But then the candidate found out more after the offer and really wasn't interested anymore. That to me speaks to, yes, we need to move fast. We also need to maintain rigor through that process and give the candidate the information they need to make those decisions. I think is a big piece.
Yeah, and I would agree with that, Kevin. And I think this has kind of started to change over the last couple months, especially. If you asked me this, same question in the beginning of the year, I would have went speed. You got to get candidates through that process as quick as possible, get them to the finish line before the next person gives an offer. While that's still very much true, to your point, I think candidates are wanting a little bit more. And if you think of, when a lot of you taking a job, you're buying the hiring manager, you're buying who you're going to work for. I know that was one of the reasons that brought me to Advance, is I liked the person I was going to report into. I knew them, I had rapport. And sometimes the speed is getting away from that rapport with you're having with, hiring leaders. And we've actually started to see candidates slowing down the process. We get to the offer quickly, and a candidate will say, "Hey, can I just have one more conversation with who's going to be my manager? I just want to get to know a little bit more." And that's a shift that we've started to see over the last few months, especially on the more mid to senior level exempt roles, where candidates are actually starting to slow things down a little bit to make sure they're making the right decision. Because believe it or not, I don't think people like the job hop. They really want to find an opportunity that they're gonna stay with for a while. People don't like interviewing constantly. They don't like changing jobs. And I think there is certainly a trend of, I want to make sure I'm making the right decision before I go. And that decision is really, how much do I get along with this manager? Is there rapport there? And do I see myself working for this person for 1, 2, 3 years down the road?
What's interesting, I didn't stop to think about this until we're just both of you were sharing some of those things there. But we're seeing some of our newer data that's just come in the last 60 to 90 days. We're seeing more than half of candidates telling us when they've jumped ship that they're regretting it, right? They have some degree of regret because right, they were just chasing a dollar, they were chasing something else, and they're like, actually, you know what? My team I worked with was actually pretty great. And comparing them to what I'm in now, or the situation I'm in now from a work perspective, that the culture stinks or whatever else, like they find some things about that. And that probably ties into what you're saying there about how can we put the brakes on just a bit, right? Do it at the pace the candidate's comfortable with. So not feeling like they're being rushed through this line of widgets to just get them a job offer quickly. And they feel like it's really tailored to their expectations.
Yeah, it's really that engagement piece we talked about earlier, right? I mean, throughout the process, people want to be highly engaged. They want to feel important from the beginning to the end. And to your point, Ben, the grass isn't always greener on the other side, and money is not the only thing that drives people to make those decisions. I think we're going to go into that a little bit later, but that bottom's going to fall out too, right? We know that. The high compensation to feed your business. So that's not going to be sustainable.
That's a good lead in, Paul, for the next one here.
Oh, really? I didn't even know that. Honestly,
there we
I
go.
Know
Hey,
good.
Very, very sneaky of you, sir. All right. So one of the other things so we talked on ghosting, right? So one of the other things we're seeing, especially in the last 12 months or so, has been a big focus between kind of July and July was paying more for candidates. We've got to pay anything, right? It's like a ransom demand almost more than a job offer. How do we get them to say yes? We pay them for any kind of things. There was even a fast food restaurant nearby where I live here in Huntsville, Alabama, that was paying people to come in and interview just to get some traction, some conversation started with people. So we saw all kinds of things there. And when we actually asked some question about this in the data, we saw that there's a number of companies that said, hey, we're trying to hire the very best people, regardless of the cost. But most of us don't have that budget that can just keep on expanding. For the most part, I'm going to hire whoever I can, whoever fits this budget, with plans to fill those gaps, fill whatever skill gaps or opportunities we have to get that person ready for what is next beyond this role. And one more thing here I'll share before I open it up a bit is we're also seeing most companies telling us that right up here, as you can see, right up here, right behind using tools and technology to help scale that and speed that up from a hiring perspective is adjusting comp. They're using that as a way to try to draw people in, as a way to try to stand out from the crowd. And the challenge with that, as I said a minute ago, is those budgets are not infinitely scalable, right? There's some limit to those things. And so I'd love to hear from the crew here. I think Mike, we might tag you to start this one off, but what's your thought on some of these things here around pay, how that is or isn't changing? And is there anything more recent that you're seeing that might be
Yeah.
shifting too?
Yeah, I would say it definitely doesn't surprise me when I look at this data. What does surprise me is you see on the first slide how little investment into training, and really starting to look at how do we hire somebody, you know, that may fit the pay scale of what we really need, but you're hiring for potential, so you're going to have to train them and things in the future. What we tend to see, and we see a lot of it, is especially over the last year, and I think it's because a lot of people are looking very much in the short term of how they're looking at not just their budgets, but, you know, how they're, you know, staffing, you know, their teams and things like that. Is a lot of companies are looking for people to make a lateral move into the exact same role that they're working today. Lateral skill sets, lateral titles, you know, virtually lateral companies. And when you think about it, put yourself in that candidate's shoes. What is going to drive you to go leave for the exact same role that you're doing today? Compensation. You know, so then all of a sudden you have all these recruiters, all these businesses just basically fighting with each other to outbid each other for that particular person. And it's kind of just cyclical. It just kind of keeps happening over and over and over again. You know, so where we've been really trying to work with our clients is, one, you know, this is kind of it's taxing, you know, to the employers to try and fight in these battles. But can you really start to look at, you know, training, development, and hiring for potential? Really understanding your employee value proposition. So outside of salary, what is the reason why somebody would come? And it's interesting when you ask that question, a lot of people can't answer it. And I think you quickly start to see that, like, well, if you can't answer that question, we got to start working with you to start developing what is the answer to that question. Be real, be honest with yourself. Don't pretend your value proposition is something it isn't, because it's just going to hurt you in the long run when it comes to the time of offer, and you're just basically competing dollar for dollar. We also start to see, you know, companies that, you know, went into the pandemic who had a bad culture, had some manager issues, have different issues, tend to have to really compensate for that when it comes to salary. And when you're up competing against other companies that have good cultures, good Glassdoor reviews out there on Indeed, and your Glassdoor is not really there and things like that. Again, put yourselves in the candidate's shoes. If you're going to make that move, it's going to have to financially make sense. And sometimes you start to see candidates going, hey, you know, your culture is not great, you know, but if you're going to pay me $40,000 more than what I'm making today, by all means. And you start to see these salaries just really start inflating. So it's definitely interesting as you start to see it. And I do wonder if you're going to start to see companies really starting to invest more in training going into next year.
The thought that I had on that, Mike, is that candidate is taking a risk. We're asking them to commit part of their life they can never get back, right? And if they're going to take that risk, it's got to pay off for them financially. Otherwise, why would they choose that over something that seems like it's going to be potentially a better fit for them? Or why would we even leverage them out of their current role anyway, right?
Yep.
Excellent. Kevin, Paul, anything that y'all would like to contribute on this piece around the pay and what's happening there?
Yeah, I think the training piece is a huge gap here, right? And I think companies they run so lean these days that this is kind of the product of that, right? It's just the investment for having someone come on board and take months or even years to get to where you need them to be is just a non-starter for a lot of our clients and a lot of companies out there today. So I do think, to Mike's point, that will certainly, you know, pop up and be more important in the future in terms of separating yourself. I still think at the non-exempt levels, at the lower end of the pay scale, pay is still the absolute number 1, 2, and 3 factor for most of these people. When they look at this, we get very little traction talking about benefits. We get very little traction talking about any other EVP, employee value proposition type scenarios. We have to with some of our clients who are not, you know, necessarily aggressive with their pay. But the ones who are even just a little bit above market, they tend to fill their jobs faster. It's just an easier job. So I think what we still are seeing today is a direct pay is still, the number one factor at the lower ends of the pay scale. And I think over the last 18 to 24 months, almost everybody at that level has traded up, right? We've gone from $13, $12 an hour, somewhere in there, to kind of 18 being the floor. And almost everyone's changed. And so then we go back into the conversation about, do they really want to change again? And if everyone's already at 18 or 19 bucks, it's really hard to get them away at $16, right? Which is what a lot of companies think they can still do. So I think it is, the employee value proposition pieces are much more important at the higher ends of the pay scale. But towards the lower end of the pay scale in the non-exempt world, it is pay still.
I didn't think so. One of the things I'll tack on there really quickly is we just finished a big study on Frontline, and that's part of what you're talking about, right? These non-exempt roles, things like that. One of the things we found is the people who told us they were most satisfied in their job, the number one reason is because they felt they were paid fairly. And for some of them, that might be for the first time. And I can add that on, I guess, but they're saying, finally, I'm getting paid what I think I'm really worth, because they're all the pay inflation things that have changed in the marketplace, and they're riding that wave essentially. So interesting perspective there on that one. All right, excellent. So let's flip forward. We're going to go to number 3 in our list here. We talked a bit about speed a little bit ago, but I'll give you a little bit more insight into that. One of the questions we ask candidates in this study is just an overarching, out of everything you could talk about, whatever it is, or everything that's important to you potentially in the hiring process, whatever that could be, let us know. And so we have kind of a ranked list from candidates about the factors in that hiring process. And we talked about pay a minute ago. This is especially true for this number one answer here about knowing the starting pay. It's true for all candidates, but it's when we cut this by frontline workers, that extends out even farther. So they want to know more than anyone else. But right behind that is a fast application that really respects my time. And so I think it was really interesting earlier. We talked about that dynamic between fast, but not too fast. We don't want them to feel rushed there. So that's part of it. But there's always other kind of things in the process, as you can see here, that show up when candidates want to know more, when they're curious about a job. And what's interesting to me is we can start cutting this by gender, by ethnicity, by age, and these things start shifting in different directions because every candidate has a slightly different perspective on the world. But the one I want to touch on here, because and Paul had some really great insight on this earlier about, hey, they may not be hired yet, but we still need to keep hiring them until they're fully on board, is 70% of candidates told us they want to get updates on their status either daily or instantly if we give them that option. That's what they prefer more than anything else. So they feel like employers overall, that's kind of been a knock on us as employers, because I've been a recruiter, right? I've been there. It's hard to respond. It's hard to make sure everybody knows what their status is, but candidates really want to know it. And given the choice, they want it right now if they have that option, because they want to know what's going on. And so they can stay abreast of this, because unlike almost any other time in the past, job seekers of every single level, every single income level and job level are having multiple opportunities, have had, at least this year, have had multiple opportunities in front of them. And this helps them to kind of figure out the logistics, figure out which one's going to be the right one to line up with their quitting date, or line up with whatever other things they're trying to figure out there from a logistical perspective. All right.
Yeah.
Kick off this one, Kevin.
I got it. Yeah. So I think, we just spoke on the topic of pay, right? That's pretty obvious. Anymore, I know there's laws going into effect across the country. Indeed and LinkedIn are already kind of ahead of those laws in terms of their own guidelines around postings. So we're getting to a place where not having your salary range on a job posting is going to start to be a real red flag for candidates. And so you've seen this is data from, even a couple months ago. That's what candidates want. And if you are able to present that information in a way that's satisfactory to candidates, you're going to have more candidates. I mean, it's just a very straightforward, we check the box scenario. We get a lot of angst about that across our client base and across, potential clients. They worry a lot about internal equity. They worry a lot about, some other real legitimate concerns, right? But at the end of the day, this is where the market is going, it's no matter what concerns we have as an organization, you're only going to hamper yourself if you're not making those adjustments in TA moving forward. The other piece, and this is kind of the that I wanted to touch on here from this call out on the right side, is we go back to the ghosting conversation, and when we talk about the non-exempt, the high volume type hiring that I specialize in, these candidates will get on a Indeed and apply to 50 jobs in an hour. They will hear back from about 5 or 10 of those jobs. And so when people put this back on the candidates to say, well, they don't communicate, they don't commit, they're saying kind of, well, we're playing the same game you're playing, right? Like, we apply to jobs we never hear. We hear 7 weeks after we apply. You get just a standard email 4 months later that you were knocked out of this process. And so I think there's a little bit of, our own industry's practices, which we know can probably be improved everywhere, are hampering that relationship in some ways, shapes, and forms. And we're very focused on that as an organization in terms of that candidate experience to try to get past a lot of those concerns. But that's more of a market as a whole, right? We don't run everybody's hiring program for them. This would be a lot better if we did, but we don't. So that is a major concern of applicants. They don't feel like that trust is kind of a two-way street. That you ghost me, I'll ghost you. So
Yeah,
what goes around comes around.
what goes around comes around.
yeah, that's a good point, Kev. And one other aspect to this, and it is vastly different between the non-exempt type of hiring that Kevin specializes in and the level. There's obviously many more candidates, to your point, that are going to apply at will. They're going to drop out for $1 more somewhere else, and those sorts of things. But I want to speak to technology real quick about it, because I think it's important, right? We always need to continue to evaluate technology and where we can employ that within the talent acquisition process. That's going to help us kind of jump some of these hurdles that we're seeing here. So 70% of these candidates want daily instant updates. Well, a recruiter can't do that across their candidate base, right? They physically cannot do that on a daily basis. They're managing a rec load. So employing technology within that process goes a long way. It may be a canned response, but clearly that third bullet point, the transparency on the status of my application, that's what they're saying. Personal touch is fantastic, and when we should try to do that where we can. But a lot of organizations don't do a good job of just letting their candidates know where they stand throughout the process. And evaluating technology can help them achieve that. Then they don't have to spend the time actually physically doing it. Kevin, I don't know if you or Mike want to speak to that a little bit, but because I know we build a lot of things for our clients around technology. To that
the
end,
technology piece is extremely important, and be able to kind of constantly keep touching them and things like that. But as you kind of go, especially into the exempt roles, I'm still a firm believer that just setting proper expectations solves a lot of this. Talking with your candidate, setting expectations around when you're going to follow up. And then the important part, again, as an employer, as a recruiter, is following through on that. Sometimes it's, hey, 2 more people are interviewing. It's this person's final interview, and it's going to take 5 days before you get feedback. I think most candidates are perfectly fine if you're honest with them and tell them that, and just say, hey, listen, there are other candidates interviewing. I think a lot of times people are afraid to actually admit that when, is it realistic that you're the only person interviewing? I think it's fine to be transparent and say that, they're looking to make a decision by Friday. You have to follow through on that, though. What tends to happen is the manager then doesn't make a decision. Then you're waiting another week, you're waiting 2 weeks, and that's when this starts to deteriorate. But when you can build good, strong relationships with your hiring managers, set proper expectation with the candidates, as you get up into the most exempt level roles, I think the daily and instantness of it is important if you're setting the proper expectations.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think a lot of this is in the last point. That's kind of this fast application process that respects my time. That goes back to that last conversation we had a few minutes ago regarding not making your process faster by just stripping out steps that are important steps. It's actually getting through all of those steps that are important, that are not extra baggage on your process. Getting through them in a timely manner, and not having a candidate go back for 6 in-person interviews when really we could have done a panel on the first one, right, and knocked that out. I think is kind of the difference there. It's not, these candidates need to learn about your culture. You can see here they want to see videos. They want career websites that share company's mission, values, culture. They want to know about your company. It's not just cut all the steps that give the candidate the stuff they need to make a proper decision. So
Yeah. What I don't know if it was encouraging me or just like, oh yeah, we knew that already. But when I asked candidates in the survey, what do you think when the process kind of slows down, drags out? Why do you think that is? And they were twice as likely to say, well, the hiring manager is the culprit here compared to a recruiter, because usually the recruiter is the one who they're interfacing with and who's usually we're having to apologize on behalf of a hiring manager not responding back often enough. And so they generally have that awareness, but that doesn't make it okay. That doesn't mean it's all right for it to continue on. So I'm going to touch on one quick thing before we transition to the next one, because we have one other stat kind of on what I would call like the most egregious form of ghosting, where someone accepts the job and doesn't show up. I want to touch on this really quickly because we talked about some things like you've got to keep communicating, you've got to keep engaging with people. You can't assume they're going to just show up anymore. And one of the things we saw in here is that a large number of people have backed out after accepting an offer. Some of those reasons are perfectly benign, right? Those happen, and some of us might have even made those decisions ourselves. But what I find in here is the number of people who have accepted an offer and then not shown up on day one is age correlated. So someone who is younger is much more likely than someone who is older, right? The older you get, the less the chance of someone saying they've actually done this at some point in their career. So I don't know if that's a maturity thing, if that's a changing social expectation, if that's something we should expect to get worse, not better, if it's a sign of the times from just the candidate's market perspective. I don't know. I can't tease that out necessarily, but all these things factor in saying, right, we should expect this, and we can't assume, even if they say yes, that they're going to show up on day one.
Yeah, what I would kind of comment, if I could, just around kind of your age part of it is, in my opinion, especially with, I'd say millennials and kind of below, loyalty has been lost on both the candidate to the employer and the employer to the candidate. There was a long time where you were very loyal to your employer, but a lot of people who went through 2008, who got laid off at the drop of a dime, as soon as COVID hit, it was literally an hour after it was announced that COVID was a thing and companies were laying people off left and right. And I think that lack of loyalty has trickled down into what you see today, especially from folks. And again, as we had this huge wave and push of get through an interview process as quick as possible, there was no loyalty built in through that interview process. So a candidate really never felt part of that organization. Some of the things that I've been pushing on, my clients is try as best you can, especially once they accept an offer, to make them feel part of the company. Send them a t-shirt, send them a hat, get them already envisioning that they work there. Building that loyalty may make them second guess before they just decide to take another offer. Because this data is right. We've been seeing offer, after an offer accepted and people backing out, all the way up to VP and president levels of organizations. We're seeing it. It's been skyrocketing over the last two or 3 months.
We used to phrase this as, especially on the non-exempt side of the house, when you get an applicant, we view that as the start of a race, right? And the emphasis used to be just solely on speed, right? That you need to be faster than everyone else to get that offer out. And I still think that's probably a beneficial place to be. But the other piece of it is you also need to be better than everyone else, right? These candidates are not, your offer needs to be better. You need to shut down them wanting to look at other places. And you also need to recognize that they're already in those conversations, right? So you're just because you got there fast and you have a good offer, they might be in that same spot with 6 or 7 other companies. And then you got to look yourself in the mirror and say, what about this process, this offer, this whole situation makes us better than the 6 or 7 other nondescript companies that they are simultaneously evaluating you against. And you can find a lot if you really look through that critically and say, this is where we need to improve, either from comp or benefits or whatever that may be, or speed, right? Sometimes you just lose these candidates because you're late. So
Yeah, one last point I'll interject, which is similar to my colleagues here is, our clients, we know this, right? Because we're in the best practice field, don't do a good job of engaging with candidates after the offer. I know we said it earlier today. I mean, that middle bar is telling, right? A lack of communication from the company and the recruiter. We think alike, Kevin, because I use the race theory here too, is it's a marathon, not a sprint.
Right.
So why would you run that thing for 25 point whatever miles and not cross the finish line? That's what hiring teams tend to do. They get the offer. This is fantastic, guaranteed start, filled my need, run my business, and then they disengage. So you didn't cross the finish line. Because in those 3 weeks, those candidates have now accepted another job, took more money. That you cannot control. What you can control is engaging with them when you're that far along in the process. So it's worth repeating, because we deal with it every day. We try to educate them, and they slip back into the same routines when we know everybody's busy.
Yes,
But
absolutely.
everyone's put a lot of time and effort into getting them to that point.
When y'all said the term loyalty building a minute ago, I think that's a great way of looking at it. Right? Are we actually building this into them, or do they truly feel like we're just moving them from one stage to another stage to another stage? How fast can we get you an offer? Right? Not just the speed piece, but like, do they feel like they're actually humans on the other side of this, that they're being treated well already before they're ever even employed? Right? This is the early honeymoon stage, right? This is the time to make sure that they're treated as best as possible, not like, oh, we've got another 20 lined up behind you.
Yeah.
Because in
And
some
I
cases,
think,
don't.
yeah, a part of the problem with that too is remote interviewing. I think everyone's getting used to. There was a time when you walked through the headquarters of a beautiful facility and you really felt part of that company walking out of an interview. A couple remote sessions, one-on-one with a couple leaders sitting in their home office, and you don't see any logos, you're not part of the company, you never really feel part of it. And I think that's an adjustment businesses are going through now is the remote interview process.
One of my good friends is in the training space, and she said that our brains actually perceive that the same way they perceive watching a video on Netflix, right? Those are just actors almost. They're not real people. And so if I make a commitment to them, they're not real anyway, or they don't feel real to us. Our brain doesn't trigger the same way as if you, right, to your point, walk in, you shake someone's hand, you look them in the eye, they show you, hey, this is where our team sits. Like you start picturing, as what you said a minute ago, you start picturing, visualizing in your head what it looks like to actually be there. And that's a very different feeling than this disconnect you feel there. All right, so we got 2 more to get through in our time here. And again, we'll try to answer some questions. We have some. Number 4 is employers are only evaluating their hiring processes about once a year. And so this, again, arguably the fastest paced time for all of us, the strangest time that I've ever seen when it comes to hiring. And employers told us when we gathered this data earlier this year that most of them had looked at something in the last year, but there was a proportion of them with things moving so quickly that had looked at what was changing between 6 and 12 months, or even more than 12 months before. And the way that I put that to, when I'm talking to some talent leaders earlier this year, I said, that's like me walking around the city of Atlanta, San Francisco, any modern city, using a map from the 1800s, right? It's a hand-drawn map. It doesn't do me any good. It's too old. It's too out of date. It's not showing me the real realities around me. And so I'd love to get your take on this. Paul, if you want to kick us off on this, what's your thought on this? Should employers how often should we be doing this? What should we be looking for? Those kind of things. What are you thinking?
Yeah, this is an interesting one. Obviously the talent acquisition scope it's evolving daily. I mean, in many different ways, right? We are educating our clients literally on a daily to weekly basis, whether that be data that's always changing, where that used to be in segments. And much like the effectiveness of your hiring process, it really needs to be done literally on an ongoing basis. The once a year, twice a year evaluation of your hiring process just won't cut it today, because things are changing daily. And so I'll give you a quick example of it. Is one of our current clients. And assessments, don't get me wrong, are an important part of many processes, right? But where they're inserted into the process or how effective they actually are is important, right? You get a lot of candidate drop off. And they had an assessment that was not a pass or fail, number one, but really wasn't aligned to the needs of their business in terms of what it was telling, whether that would be a potential candidate continuing the process. And so we provided them a lot of data and analysis and recommendations around that. And we did a pilot with them, and they removed the assessment out of the process. And lo and behold, I mean, honestly, it was much more streamlined. Candidates were not getting knocked out of the process. They were filling their jobs in a timely fashion. And so that's just one example of something that you've got to evaluate that, right, on an ongoing basis. When you look at the data and you find that a lot of candidates, if you put hurdles up that you think mean well, they're not really relatable anymore, you're going to lose a lot of talent that ultimately would have been very successful in the organization. So that's just kind of my feedback on the things that we tend to see. You got to do it early and often on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, I would say, no one saw the pandemic. No one saw this wave coming, and that's probably how it is with most waves of crazy hiring, right? Is it's, you may have done an evaluation of your hiring process in February 2020. That by the end of March 2020 was totally out of date, right? Totally. And if you weren't planning on revisiting that till the next budget season, right? You lost a year of effective talent acquisition. And so I think, to Paul's point, we every aspect of your process you need to be evaluating kind of constantly. And there definitely be vendors that come in there and say, look, you got to get rid of all of it. I would say in this current today, November of 2022, we're probably closer to adding steps back into the process that we removed two or 3 years ago than we are advising people to continue to remove things. Again, back to the point of making sure you have enough rigor in the process to actually allow yourself to make the right determination and the candidate to make the right determination. But 2-3 months ago, we probably would not have been recommending that. And so we're all, we just, we have a pulse on the market because we do this across multiple companies. If you're by yourself in one talent acquisition function, just doing it with one company, it's really hard to see the trends that are taking hold across other verticals, other types of industries, things like that. And so I think it is a benefit of, not to toot our own horn, but a benefit of working with an RPO is that we, Mike, Paul, myself, we look at dozens of different processes every day, and we're able to evaluate and leverage what's working where, and bring that to across all of our clients as a best practice.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting that we're able to do is we have data points across multiple different clients and really paying attention to that data daily in order to start seeing like what's the trend going on. Are we starting to see applicants slow down across our client base? Our interview to hire ratio is starting to increase, or dropouts starting to happen different places, and that really helps us from really understanding our processes and what has to be improved as well. So I think it's really important to understand your data, but be able to refresh it and look at it on a constant basis and get an understanding of what is it trying to tell you. And if you can try and get ahead of that, that's when you start to understand how much do you have to refresh your process.
Yep.
Excellent. Well, that point a minute ago, Kevin, that's why I started transitioning here, because this is our last key thing. So again, if you have any questions, I know there's one sitting there we're going to get to in just a minute. If you have any questions or anything you'd like to throw in there for the team here, we're happy to answer those with the time we have available. But the last thing we saw here is that employers have some specific things that they want from an RPO partner. And so for those employers who are using one, we asked them beyond just filling seats, and you've already heard this in the conversation today, all the insights coming here around what's happening, trends, all these things, right? You're hearing things beyond just, okay, we're putting someone's rear end in a seat to hire and fill a slot. When it comes to that, what other things do employers value in that relationship? And so we see here this broad range of things. And one of the things that excited me so much is that employers are saying, hey, we really want not just the service piece, we want ideas. You're seeing all these things. And so I, as you were sharing a minute ago, some of you guys, I was thinking like, this is one of the key things. And this is why employers end up partnering, because we're seeing even in some of our brand new data on the value of an RPO, employers who are getting more ROI from those partnerships are saying, let's go beyond just filling spots and help us think about our strategy for hiring overall. Are we making the right decisions? Are we aligned with the business? How do all these things fit together with the direction the organization is going? Because hiring is the engine that makes it go. And so that's one of the key things that I saw here. There's a lot of other stuff. Anything else here stand out to you guys you want to touch on?
I thought it was interesting to see that the industry expertise that they can depend on was as low as it was. We typically do hear a lot, the customers want us to have their exact industry experience and want our recruiters that are their exact experience. And what makes me happy is personally, I'm a firm believer that, somebody with, a core understanding of the recruitment principles can recruit in really any industry. And I think we position ourselves as an RPO that way. I would say my top performers are usually what I would consider my general recruiters that can work on multiple different positions. As an RPO provider, sometimes you're going to work IT, corporate, finance, all these different types of roles. So I do believe people who have a diverse experience across multiple different industries and recruited in different backgrounds are able to provide the innovative ideas much better than somebody who's kind of focused in one area. So I'm happy to see that's kind of trending that way.
I compare that to being a realtor, right? We don't ask our realtors to know how to build the house, right? And they're at the end of the day, a lot of clients are looking for companies who've worked specifically within this niche, within this. And our expertise is finding the candidates, right? We don't need to know how to do what you do, and we don't, we'll learn enough to be dangerous, but at the end of the day, you need an expert in market making, right? We're making a market between your jobs and the candidate pool, and that's really a very, I think, overlooked sometimes in selecting an RPO is industry experience is only going to take you so far. The other piece is just industry experience. Once you start working with a number of companies in the same industry, all of a sudden those companies become hands off for you to recruit from. And so you're actually kind of tying one hand behind your back if you're representing a number of companies in the same spot, because those candidate pools are going to become off limits to you. So just a couple thoughts on that. I think at the end of the day, the biggest piece that we can deliver here is the innovative ideas. And that it's changed. I wouldn't say it's changed. We've always been able to do that. It has become, faster. The changes swing more drastically. I mean, we go from, what process changes that would have taken us months to convince clients to do, we can convince them in a phone call now sometimes. And it's a massive change to their whole process. But it's just because we have experience and data that's saying that this is the most effective way to do it. And, our clients, we've built great partnerships with our clients and they trust us. So I think from those perspectives, that innovative ideas to address, there's a lot of challenges out there. That's the biggest differentiator I think RPOs can bring to you.
Yeah. And one last point on that is that the other spike, the technology expertise, as I mentioned earlier, I mean, that's what our clients look for. I'm glad to see that on there. We are experts in talent acquisition. I mean, we really are. Our organization, we are constantly evaluating technology and how it can benefit our client partners. We have a lot of companies that are smaller, mid-market companies that just really are antiquated. And to be able to bring that to the table, they want it, as you can see here. It's how do you employ that and recommend that to kind of move them into what I would call the 21st century. So this is my favorite slide because all the spikes I actually agree with.
Yeah.
You're doing a little fist pump for each of those, Paul, when they align. Excellent. All right. Wonderful. All right. So we're gonna take a couple questions, answer a few for you. While I'm going to take a look at the questions, I want to actually ask something that I didn't prepare any of you guys for. I want to know if you can remember the first rec you ever filled, the first job you ever filled. Do you remember what type of job that was? It could have been, some of you mentioned many years in your intros. I won't say how many, but I told y'all in our prep call that mine was a Black Hawk helicopter instructor pilot. That was the first one I ever had to do, which is crazy. What about the rest of y'all? What was the first job?
So I got a little funny story to go along with it. So I was an IT staffing recruiter, right out of college. And ironically, my first placement was a contract forklift driver. I was helping the person who sits next to me. Second day of the job, it was for an aerospace company. He drove the forklift through about $40 million worth of material and was let go. So then
Who hired that guy?
I went back to IT recruitment pretty fast.
My first one was somewhat boring. My second one was a salesperson for a company that sells body parts to med schools and research facilities of dead people. It was really creepy, and I still have weird dreams about that one. That one freaked me out. No, I was the new guy. No one wanted to touch it on the team, and that search landed on my plate, and I got it filled. Actually, pretty big comp package for that type of work if you're interested. But yeah, that one was a little freaky.
Oh my goodness. Wow. Just missed Halloween with that one.
Yeah.
I'll wrap us up.
Yeah, that's a good one. I think that's got me beat. I'll date myself. I started out as an IT recruiter in agency and staffing, much like Mike, although a little bit before him, as you can see the gray hair. IT roles in preparation for Y2K. That's when I started my career, the infamous Y2K. Many technology type stacks back and mainframe, all of those sorts of things. And needless to say, every company everywhere was hiring talent for that, right? And so it was incredibly challenging to recruit that. So I thought to myself, geez, this is a great way to make a positive impact in my new career when I can't find anybody. And then lo and behold, we found out that the clocks worked and all the money spent for that was
Not. There we go. Wow. Okay. Awesome. Thank y'all for humoring me with that one. I was just curious on that. So we got a good question that came in earlier when we started talking about the ghosting piece very early on. One of the attendees said, what are your thoughts about applicants not being responsive even to that initial attempt to schedule a phone screen? Any thoughts, any suggestions? Is that a lost cause, or are there ways to get them back on the hook at that point?
I think, yeah, that's my world. I think honestly, the more second chances you give those types of people, the more you're going to get burned. You have to remember what an application process looks like, and chances are they did apply to 40 or 50 jobs. They probably didn't even read the job description, quite honestly, especially if you've got easy apply enabled, which is a best practice today, as frustrating as it is. These candidates can apply to so many jobs so quickly. And so if they get a wave of responses back, they're not going to schedule 25 interviews, right? They're probably going to schedule 3 or 4. So either potentially you were a little late, or, those types of people, it's hard to be that competitive in that environment. And so it may be a bit of a blessing in disguise that you aren't spending a ton of time on someone who's just applied to 50 different jobs.
Chasing that person who was a maybe all along.
You'll be chasing them the whole way, right?
I think speed is very important there too. Don't let that applicant who just applied sit for 4 or 5 days before you reach out to try and schedule that interview. And at the same time, it's important to know your ratios. That's the no-shows, the phone interviews are going to happen. As much as you can understand the percentages that it happens, then you can start to look at your funnel overall and understand how many people do I have to bring into this process, knowing X amount are going to drop out here, to make sure you have enough for the end.
Yeah, and it also allows you to figure out, is what you're doing working, right? So Kevin deals with this, a plethora of outreach initially, right? In the non-exempt space, it's far different than Mike and I. We don't have that happen as much because, again, the recruiters are speaking with people. It's more pointed searches. So your outreach efforts, whether it be automated scheduling, what is that messaging looking like too? And all of those types of strategic things that warrant maybe taking a look at as well to engage them to want to schedule that interview.
That was one of the things I've done more this year, is talking to employers about. We're seeing some things in the data. Usually we're like, we should just communicate more often, more things, be more open. But this year I've been talking to our employers about, when you're responding to someone, when you're interacting with someone, here are some of the things we're finding in the data that are important. And you all saw some of those in the stats we shared today. If those things are important to candidates, those things can be woven back into that communication you come back to them with, right? Whether it is upfront for a pay rate, especially for non-exempt or frontline roles, or something else. If you're hearing this thing it's a priority for candidates, why aren't we weaving that back in? Because they're telling us what's important. That's the #1 rule of sales. Listen for the signals and then hit those back when you get a chance to it. Okay. All right, we got another good question in, and I know some of y'all talked about y'all started careers in like staffing years ago, and now you're in the RPO space, so this is a good fit for y'all. This person said, our company's never considered an RPO to help with TA. Can you tell us more about the differences between an RPO and an actual staffing agency? What does it look like?
I'll take that to start, because I think we've all been in recruiting, and I've been in agency and staffing actually for the first 10 years of my career, transition to RPO. They're very different. There's a benefit to staffing and a benefit to agency recruiting, certainly. But the value out in RPO is that we're a true extension of our clients' HR and talent acquisition teams. We go to market branded by that company. We're finding talent for them directly. We're not sharing candidates with other companies. They own the talent, they own the candidates. We work within their ATS systems. So we're a true extension of their team. And I think the other value add with an RPO partnership is the scalability of it, right? Mike talked earlier about how we staff our teams with very strong recruiters. Number one, the talent is there, but we're able to scale. So when the client's business needs fluctuate and go up and down, we can pivot and support them with that as well. So much different. And we get that question a lot, even in some of our post initial sales conversations with prospects. It comes up several times. And it's almost like, do they want to hear a different answer? Do they not believe it at first? And so very common, very common.
Yeah. I'd say functionally for the people, in the seats at our clients, the biggest difference that they'll feel initially, or one of the biggest differences, is that staffing firms have to prioritize the recs they can fill easily, and they're not on the hook to definitely fill it, right? They're only mostly getting paid if they're successful. We are on the hook contractually to fill all of your jobs. And therefore, sometimes that means we got to come back and partner with you on what's going on here, but you're not going to get the scenario where you're sending your job out to 14 different staffing firms and no one ever sends you anything back. I mean, we're true partners here, and we are committed to every rec that we get and filling it, in a timely manner. So I think that feels a lot different for a lot of our clients who's got they have some tricky jobs, and it may not be a real quick fill for a staffing agency, and they'll just move on to the next job that they can fill quickly. And that's just kind of the difference in their business model. Not necessarily bad or anything. It's just that's where their incentives lie.
Yeah. And it's funny you say that, Kev, because when I interview, recruiters and things like that all the time, and if they're coming from a more staffing agency centric environment, it's actually one of the pieces that I usually hit on is, how they handle a situation where, there's going to be some difficult recs, and you can't hide from it. It's there. We're contractually, we have to fill that role. We have accountabilities built in throughout our entire process, whether it's time to fills, interview to hires, different things like that we're holding ourselves accountable to, that we work with our clients. So there is no, okay, this one's too hard, let's go over here. You have to really work and partner with that employer. And again, you're acting as you're part of that business. So the partnerships and really partnering and working with a hiring manager, with HR, to figure out how to solve that problem, we're in it, and we're there to solve it.
Yeah, it's very strategic and not tactical.
Yep.
Yeah, very strategic, not tactical. True partnership driven relationships that we do.
That's what I was going to say. I talked to an employer recently that's working with an RPO, and that the word partnership, they said, this is an investment for us. This is not just another expense, another line item. This is something that truly benefits us as an organization. And because of that, right, we invest in this, we plan for this. They're in these key meetings with us, alongside us, like true partners. We're not just updating them after the fact. Like, they're playing a part in this. It's much bigger than some of the other vendors that they use in other areas.
Yeah.
All
and
right.
I actually try and get people to, don't refer to us as a vendor, refer to us as your partner. Give me a seat at the table.
Excellent. Wonderful.
I actually said
you.
that to a C-level executive recently.
There you go.
In a kind way.
Great. Well, I can jump back in here and just wrap things up. I really appreciate everyone's time today. It's been a great conversation. Mike, Ben, Paul, thanks for taking the time. If you're interested in partnering or learning more about partnering with the best RPO in the country, feel free to connect with one of us on LinkedIn, and we'd be happy to have a conversation with you and see if there's any ways we can help out in your staffing and hiring needs. So I appreciate everyone's time today. It was a great conversation, and I will talk to you soon.
Have a good one. Thank you, everybody.
See you guys.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Take care.